Next on News Talk, AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran.
Well, here on the program today, we have a fellow who's got his name in the Old Irish, sometimes known as Gaelic. I don't know what it is. I never took Gaelic. I would say Richard. Is it Richard?
Yes, it's Richard. Or it can also be Roykard, but there's different variations.
Okay, so I'll call you Richard for the sake of lack of confusion. How's that?
That's perfect.
How do you pronounce your last name, Richard?
It's Cremines.
Cremine. All right.
Yeah.
Is that an Irish version of another name?
It is the angelization from Cremine. It's they just added over time it changed and it become there's different variations.
Where do you live now, Richard?
Right now I'm living in Kentucky.
Kentucky. Well, now, how many guys in Kentucky have Gaelic names? Maybe you're it, huh?
Well, there's a few of us that use the original spellings just to for historical, traditional keeping for the namesake to keep the name alive.
Okay, now, my people, my mother and father, were from Ireland. How far back does your heritage go before they came to this country?
I can trace my heritage on my paternal side to, I know, absolutely 1658. And on my maternal side, it would be my paternal side mother's grandmother. On my paternal side, I can get to 1235.
1235. Well, that wouldn't be in the United States. That was back in...
No, not at all. Now, in the United States, my ninth great-grandfather came here in October of 1677.
All right, okay. So, you're long time Americanized in your family. Would that be a fair statement? I think it is, yeah.
That would be a fair statement. Yes, it would.
Well, then, let me ask you bluntly, what's this thing about the Irish that you've got going?
Well, I'm American by birth, but Irish by blood. My story, it came from wanting to know my heritage, where my family originated, what we were about, where we came from, what we went through to get to the United States. And my family was real secretive. They never talked about, the old country. They never would volunteer it. Even if, I became interested in my heritage when I was about 17. I'd always been drawn to that culture for some reason. I never knew really why. So I started to ask my grandfather. And he lived in southern Ohio, and we go up there every summer. So I'd pester him and bug him and ask him a bunch of questions and everything. And he'd say, never worry about where we've been, only worry about what you're going to be doing in the future. And it would aggravate me because he would never tell me anything. So this became an obsession for me. And so I started, at that time, the internet really, there was internet, but I didn't have real access to it. It wasn't, mainstream, like where you could go to the library and do it. So I spent a lot of time in the library, researching through periodicals and microfilm and everything. And it's just become an obsession for me over the last about 23 years.
Well, let's talk about Irish slaves. That's really why I wanted you on the show. I was just curious what got you into all this. But it was your grandfather who came from the old country, right?
It was my ninth great-grandfather. He was an indentured servant.
All right, he was an indentured servant, one step up from a slave.
He was a slave.
He was a slave, all right.
Yes, because he left Ireland. We figure between 1652 and 1657. And he was transported from Cobb to Montserrat in the West Indies. That's where a lot of people went at this time. But, but there was a whole tale of history that started with Henry VIII in 1536.
He was a particularly nasty person, Henry VIII, and he pretty much ruined England. People don't realize. They think about all the wives that he had, some of whom he killed.
Pure monarchy.
Yeah,
I mean, he was pure rule with the iron fist. He was just...
And he bankrupted the country, and the whole country was wrecked after his tenure as the king. All right, now, Henry VIII, is he the one that started to enslave the Irish and put them out in the West Indies?
It began with him. He went in and he wanted to change religion. He wanted to change, because he separated from the Vatican at this time.
Yeah, because they wouldn't give him a divorce, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and so he went from that time to, hey, I'll take over, I'll conquer Ireland, another kingdom, because he wanted it, I believe, for his second wife. Mm-hmm. She wanted Cara, which is in the old Ireland, or Erin. And so he said, okay, well, you're going to have it. But the Irish wanted, they were simply fighting for their freedom of choice, like we did, in our American Revolutionary War. Mm-hmm. And it was against the British also. But a lot of Irish fought in that too.
Well, wait a minute. Let me back you up, Richard. So he's the one that started to enslave the Irish.
Not enslaved, but it began with him.
All right.
And a whole turn of events went through and occurred during his reign. And then he died, of course. And then and then we come to James II, who in 1625 proclaimed that he required all Irish political prisoners to be transported overseas and sold to English settlers in the West Indies.
I don't want to correct you, but that would have to be James I. Have to be James I. James II was rather sympathetic to Catholics. James I wasn't. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're right.
Yeah.
James I.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's
okay.
Later on. But
right.
Thank you. He did this proclamation in 1625, and he sold about 30,000 Irish slaves to the West Indies.
Now, were these slaves or indentured servants? Because you said your ancestors were...
These were forced deportations. They took them to the West Indies, to Antigua and Montserrat, and they sold them. The Irish slaves didn't do so well in the hot, and the heat, and the humidity of the Caribbean.
No, they wouldn't.
No, they were dying. They were working them out in the fields. And these were sugar plantations, and they just worked them. I mean, it was horrific. Even still, to this day in Montserrat, you can be talking to a descendant of an African slave, and he'll speak in an Irish accent.
Really?
Huh. Really?
Yeah.
Really. Now, and it just increased, because, with the political arena during that time, it was just a mess. You had Cromwell that started coming in there. We're talking,
1640 to 1650, right?
Yes, 52.
Yeah.
And, and you had, so he was ruthless. There was, at this point, over 1/3 of the entire population were killed or forced to exile.
The Irish, right.
The Irish.
Yeah.
A lot went to France, a lot went to South America, and quite a few came to America because, some of them did have the means, because these were the upper class Irish, and they did have the means to travel. and commerce and trade and live. And they did come here. And some did, the indentured way, the way we brought up, way we were brought up to think of, that some paid for their passage and worked it off so they could have land. Yes, some did. But prior to all this, they were slaves. They were held up in, slave ships. Whole, sloops were cut out and chained just as the African slaves were.
So originally the slaves in the West Indies were Irish, but they couldn't survive in that heat. I mean, they started to bring them in from Africa, right?
Right. So they were used more indoors. They became more like laborers to work on inside the homes and the barns and stuff, and then it took them out of the heat. And then that's when the African slaves started coming in, slowly, because there was what they called the Middle Passage, and that was the trip that all the slave ships and the commerce and everything went. It went, from like Africa to the Caribbean to the Virginias, and then back over to England and back into Ireland.
We have to take a break, Richard. You hang on there, brother.
Okay, I sure will.
When we get back, I want to ask you. I don't know what I want to ask you. We'll find something. Stay tuned, Richard.
It is mind blowing. There's a lot of information.
Oh, I guess so. We're talking to Richard O'Criman. Is that how, am I saying it?
O'Criman.
Yeah. Well, it's close. Yeah. He is Irish by blood, he says, goes way back, American by birth. I'm much closer to the old country than you are, but you obviously know more about it than I do. Now, do they know in Ireland? I don't think they do. Maybe they do, that their ancestors were put into slavery by Henry VIII and then Oliver Cromwell?
Oliver Cromwell and James I.
Okay. Is that taught in the Irish schools? I've never heard my cousins talk about that.
I've got buddies and friends in Cork and around the areas that my family came from. And, when I talk to them, over Facebook or over the phone, they're like, "Are you nuts?" No, they paid for the way. They went over there and worked. And I was like, yeah, some of them did. Some of them had the means.
Yeah, but they don't know that the Irish were enslaved by, you say Henry VIII started with indentured servants.
Well, he didn't start with indentured. He conquered Ireland, which set off, it set off a period of time that was plagued with war and forced subordination, and, he just ruled with an iron fist. And he, it was all for him, you're going to bow down, you're going to obey me, and do as I say, or else.
Well, he bankrupted the country, if even the English probably have to admit that. But they have to hold him up as important because everything changed after the Tudors. Well, all right. So now we've got Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, probably the last guy in the whole world that anyone would want to have lunch with. I'm serious. He's a very deadly serious guy and not a very nice guy. He tried to eliminate all the Irish. He went over there, and you'd say he got a third of them. I thought he got more than that.
Within a decade's time, from between 1641 and 1641 to 1652, 500,000 Irish were killed by the English.
Yeah,
the New People's Army.
Well, that was Cromwell and his Puritans. Now,
I'm sorry.
That wasn't the only attempt to eliminate the Irish. Many historians now look back in the 19th century famine, which the British didn't start, but they made no real effort as a government to save the Irish because that was going to be pardon the expression, a final solution to the Irish problem, which the British always considered the Irish to be a problem. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
Yeah.
The potato plight.
Yeah.
Um,
They didn't cause it, but they didn't do much to help either. No.
No. In all actuality, if the Irish had known what the English were doing, they would have had another rebellion because they were taking all the food and sending it to the colonies.
Yeah. And the English...
And when the Irish tried to live off these rotten potatoes. And,
You know, I had a friend of mine, and he said to me, and I've never thought about this, in Ireland, there's no place in Ireland where you're terribly far from the sea. Why didn't the people suffering from the famine simply go to the sea and live on fish? I'd never thought about that. I suppose they couldn't leave the land. Wasn't that the real reason?
well, you know, a lot of them didn't have mode of transportation. You know, the inner parts of Southern Ireland and the inner parts, you know, hills and just bogs, and they never really had a way to really... They could walk out, I guess, but they'd probably die by the time they got...
Well, they couldn't walk out because they belonged to the English lords who owned the land.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
that's got to be the answer, because you're right. If you're that hungry, you'd walk 30 miles, and it wasn't much more than that, 30 or 40 miles for most of them. I've always been curious how my people survived the famine, but Irish... Checking Irish ancestry is not easy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, Richard. This has been very revealing and very interesting. If people want to know more, I know you put out an almost daily thing, don't you?
Well, I could do something every day.
No, I don't mean on the air. I mean on the internet. Don't you do something almost?
Oh, yes, I do. I make posts on Facebook. I have a few blogs. IrishByGod.com, blogspot.com. But I do that the IrishByGod.blogspot.com is more or less my own family history, kind of a journal of what I do on my family history. But on the Facebook, I do more of the history and the historical part of the Irish slavery.
Now, how many times you've been back over to the old country?
Actually, to tell you the truth, no.
You've never been back?
I had the opportunity to go.
You've never been back, right?
No, I haven't been back, but I'm going here hopefully by the spring.
Well, you better hurry up, pal.
They're enjoying more freedom, the Republic of Ireland.
Well, there's a whole lot of stuff there. We've got a lot of Irish people or people who are of Irish descent in our area. And I got to tell you, I didn't know till just recently. A guy was reading your stuff, and he told me about it. So I thought I got to have that guy on the air. Irish slavery, and, of course, I knew about the genocides. All right, pal, thank you very much. Nice talking with you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Well, I did too. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, there's an Irishman who can trace it all the way back. I didn't follow that very carefully, but I guess he's gotten his genealogy back to the mid-17th century. Wowsy. Didn't know you could do that. And, well, there you go. I mean, that's today's show. Stay tuned now for more news and information on AM 1480 WLEA.